well, welcome back to episode 3, and we're going over our book read that we have right now, and we'll be talking about Sola Gratia today, and some other things, I'm sure, as it comes up. But if you've been following along with us, this is only our 3rd episode, and we hope to do more. I'm Pastor Josh at Kingston's First Congregational Church, and this is
Katie Johnson. I'm the Children's Discipleship Director at First Congregational Church.
Right, and we are just having open conversation. We call this Along the Road, and it's conversations where faith and life intersect. And we know that's not a one-time thing, but it's ongoing. And we're using this book to launch all of this. So we'll see how it goes. We'll keep going. So if you're with us in the church right now and you have the book by S.D. Ellison called The Five Solas, it's this tiny little book right here. You can find it online. You are welcome to look at it beforehand or watch this, or either way, one or the other. And just use that as a continuing conversation. We welcome comments. You can put those in.
And questions.
And questions. You can put those in there. And if there are other topics that come up because of that, we welcome that as well. We'd like to talk about that maybe in future episodes after we've gone through this book. Because we won't always just talk about books, just different topics in life and ministry and faith and how that intersects. So we're talking about the second part of the Reformation, or second sola, of which you'll learn like they can be in different orders, but this book is writing the second one as the Sola Gratia. Mm-hmm. Sola Gratia just simply means in English, in grace alone. And so the chapter actually starts out with 2 different people, and you were talking about the one that was interesting, Erasmus. What were your thoughts about who this is, or if people even know who this is? But what were your thoughts about him?
Right, so Erasmus is one of those names that I had heard before, but I didn't really have a sense of what his impact was. Mm-hmm. And so he was born in the late 1460s in Rotterdam, Netherlands. He was considered one of the preeminent humanists of his day. But interestingly enough, he publishes an updated translation of the New Testament from Greek.
Yeah, from the Greek, yeah.
And he found some errors that made a big difference. It didn't change his mind, but it sure helped Luther a lot.
And the errors he found were in the current translation, which was the Latin Vulgate.
Yes.
This was before anything in German or in English was translated. It was in the Latin Vulgate, which would have been the Bible of the Catholic Church at the time.
The standard.
The standard Bible. And most people didn't read Latin anyway. They were just told what it was.
Read.
That's right. They were just told what it was. But for him to find these, that's very important. He was not just some random guy. He was pretty well educated.
Yep.
And he knew what he was doing. And him and Luther really agreed on some of these things. But they also disagreed on things as well. And I think that's what kind of leads us into this chapter. A lot of reformers use Erasmus's writing to talk about the scripture and how it's important. That was last week's topic, Sola Scriptura, but it really talks about that importance of it. But they had a very different view about life itself. And that's where they really kind of go apart in that way. Yep. How would you mention that view and the way they were and how different they were?
Well, I would say probably their biggest difference was their view of man.
Yeah.
So Erasmus was what's considered a humanist, and I had to look that up because, it's one of those things. I have a general idea of what it probably means, but here's the definition. Humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems.
So, even in the time of Erasmus for now, the idea of what's to come in the future, or heaven, or being saved, or something like that, he would have said, we have as humans the ability to get there on our own.
That's right. And we have the ability to choose whether we do evil or good.
Right. And you even see it even in our modern day language. I was actually talking to somebody about that. I was meeting with someone for coffee recently, and we were talking about this same idea of the inherent sin that we have, and that in language we'll say, oh, he's a good kid, or that's a good kid. And we are inherently placing on children or people goodness That's that human aspect, that they have their own ability to do good. And that's really where they come to heads with Luther and the Reformers, because they took this new translation, this better translation from the Greek, and started seeing that really wasn't how we would say Sola Gratia works, how we understand humanity is very, very central to grace, to salvation, and to everything itself.
That's right.
You know,
it's pretty fundamental.
It is pretty fundamental. It says here on page 22, so if you have the book, you can look at page 22 at the bottom. The Reformers argue this, that humanity had no capacity within themselves to desire or earn salvation, or to be good. Rather, from beginning to end, they argued salvation is a work of God. So, salvation is grace alone, God's gift to us alone. And that would be pretty much opposed. They talk about some other people during this time as we move forward. You know, Erasmus was kind of laying this out, but then in the Reformers, you have people that have different thoughts. You have people like Pelagius and Augustine, and they come from these same two opposing views as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, it's not that much of a stretch to say that Erasmus follows Pelagius.
Yeah.
And Luther follows Augustine.
Yes. Yeah, and that would be pretty much how they see it. Where even in Erasmus might have been a humanist, and Pelagius was trying to be, within the church, but he would say we have that choice. Like, we can earn this. And most of the Catholic Church at the time would have gone along with Pelagius in the sense of earning your salvation. Of course, that can take it way off the rails, which it did, in indulgences and in buying goods for those that have already died and earning their salvation. And we can earn this thing, and it comes on you.
It puts a lot of pressure on you.
It puts a lot of pressure on you, and Augustine would have argued differently, So then you have this battle back and forth pretty often.
Yeah.
It says here that in 1524 there's a big separation between the idea of free will and God's grace. And Erasmus goes with Pelagius, and Luther goes with Augustine. It says Erasmus believed that there was something within humanity that could give them salvation, where Luther, Augustine, Calvin, and others would have said there's nothing inherently in us that can go there. If you're a full type of Calvinist person, you believe in the whole tulip. The first of that is total depravity. We don't even have the ability to think of salvation on our own. We're fully apart from that. Luther says we are not able to, and it's a sovereign, divine grace of God that draws us to that. And so that opens up the whole idea of sovereignty and free will and where that lands.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And Luther, I don't know if have you ever read the work that he wrote? It was his argument. Modern day
Bondage
times.
of the will?
Bondage of the will, yeah. Modern day times, people argue by posting another podcast or making another thing or tweeting something else out and they go back and forth. Well, in their times, they didn't have that. They wrote a book. They wrote a treatise or something up against it.
It's kind of a big book.
Have you ever read Bondage of the Will?
I have not.
I've seen pieces of it. It is very difficult to get through, very weighty to walk through. And interesting enough, it says that Luther, this was the part that he wanted, after he passed away, this was one of his works he wanted to keep going because it was that important. And it helped a lot of reformers, people who used it. Maybe you've heard of Tyndale.
Yep.
Who was a big Bible translator as well. Kramer, Ridley, Latimer, very big preachers, especially in Europe and in England. John Knox, Zwingli, Brewster, and others. They use bondage of the will to understand this depravity that we have, and as an argument against the humanist view or the Pelagius view that we earn our own salvation. Mm-hmm. So the next section of the book kind of leads us to this whole, how do we clarify these battles?
What does the Bible say?
What does the Bible say? How far apart are they? Because they seem so far apart, but I believe Pelagius or Luther, they weren't trying to be radical. They were just coming at a different
They're trying
direction.
to be accurate.
They're trying to be accurate, yeah. And so what I think is important, and they pointed out here, is that neither of them deny the presence of sin. Like, it's there. It's there. It's definitely there. It's more about when is it there, or what's our part in it.
Where did it come from?
Yeah, and you work with children. I mean, many of us have children. We work with children.
Yes.
So do you see sin, this depravity, this missing the mark of holiness that God would have for us. Do you see that in children? How young do you see that when you work with children?
You see it pretty early.
You see it
because it's all about them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very egocentric.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm sure even if you're not in their homes, you see it even on Sunday mornings when you have them in class or different things. Even the good kids, and what we might say are good kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And our humanist
well-behaved.
Well-behaved kids.
That's what good means.
Regulated kids. It's interesting. So the idea of that being there is inherent. But what Luther is saying and other reformers are saying, it's not just we have sin, it's like we are sinful from the beginning. And that's a big difference.
As opposed to it being a choice.
As opposed to it being a choice, correct.
Right.
It's the idea of we are all already condemned in our sinfulness. You know, and Paul talks about it as well. For all have sinned. Everybody falls short of God's glory.
Right.
As opposed to some people have chosen to, you know, and you can or you can't, you know.
Yes, and some people choose it more than others, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just look at how full our prisons are.
Yeah.
And, you know,
and on the other side, some people choose what we might call good things, but even those are inherent in maybe building themselves up or their own pride. I remember an old Friends episode. I don't know if you ever watched Friends way back in the day. But one of the characters tried to do a selfless good act. And throughout the entire episode, they were never able to do it. And they did a lot of good things for other people, but it was always, once they announced it, once they said something, someone in the Friends pointed out the wayward action of even their good acts.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very interesting. So the process of these battle lines is not about do we have sin. It's about are we sinful at the beginning or do we make the choice? And the reformers, especially with this theology and the biblical theology, is that we understand that we didn't have a choice. We are sinful through Adam and through others. This is the line that we have, where Pelagius and the Roman Church would have said, no, you have that choice. That's where they're able to take that further in that direction.
That's the point of divergence.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is. It says here that it became a process in which a bad person make themselves better. That's what the Catholic Church would have said. Or you can even see it today. People, you can make yourself better. You can become a better person.
Self-improvement.
Absolutely. And plenty of sections, well, in what used to be called bookstores, but online stores and stuff now, that are all about self-improvement. Yeah. So it's still relevant.
Because we all recognize we need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's true. So humanity, according to Luther, humanity makes no positive contribution to their own salvation. And that's what you'll see. Like if you're following along, you'll see that like on page 26. But this is the short version. I love this quote here. It says, in short, from beginning to end, salvation is God's grace. Sola Gratia. It is by grace alone. It also says it's initiated by God alone. So you didn't even deserve the grace. I think that's important for us to remember. We didn't deserve the grace. That's a part of Luther's battle.
Because how would you define grace?
Well, grace is an unmerited gift, undeserved gift. Yeah. But often
that's inherent in the definition of its word.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Luther struggled with that for years. Even before he came to writing his thesis and stuff. There's a story of him confessing in the Catholic Church, and the priest told him, Luther, you need to go out and sin before you come back and confess. Because he was so worried that what was in him, he didn't understand grace at the time. He really couldn't. It was that weight on him because he couldn't get there himself. And, he tried very, very hard. So once he understood that God's initiating the grace, God is moving this. And also you'll see through part of this, he doesn't just initiate it, he accomplishes it and finishes it, which is very different. The book points us to two passages. Did you happen to look at either one of them?
Probably, but which ones are you thinking?
Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomy passage in
Deuteronomy 7:7.
In chapter 7.
Yeah.
And
then Ephesians 2.
And then Ephesians 2. And I think most people think of Ephesians 2, and we can get to that in a moment. But the Deuteronomy passage is the one that I think is interesting. Most people don't jump to Deuteronomy when they think of grace. So what were your thoughts on Deuteronomy as you opened that up and looked at that?
Right. So the point of Deuteronomy 7:7 is that God has chosen Israel They didn't ask to be chosen. They didn't wish to be chosen.
Right.
They didn't do anything to deserve it.
Right.
They were just there, and God said, I pick you.
Yeah. Yeah, if you go back even before Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is written after they've been removed and rescued from Egypt. But you go back before Egypt, where Joseph got him into Egypt. You go back before that, all the way to when Abraham was called. He's the father of this nation. Why was Abraham chosen? No one knows. He was, a pagan person worshiping something else, and God just calls him. And that's I think that's the point of that. Mm-hmm. That the grace, he did nothing to deserve it. He wasn't good in any way. And we read his life in Genesis. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. And so did his sons and his sons' sons, and it continues and so on.
Yeah.
So what we see in Deuteronomy 7 is that it's God's sovereign love, faithfulness, and grace. And this explains Israel's election. Now, they have a purpose, so these people become a role model and a purpose for what God can do for all of humanity.
Right.
But I like what it says in page 28. It's not the holy character that would have already been present in Israel. That's not why they were chosen, because they don't have that.
Right.
They definitely don't have that. So, interesting understanding of Deuteronomy 7. It says at the end of that section that it is an act of loving kindness initiated by love, exemplified by sheer grace. So Sola Gratia, grace alone, Israel has no claim upon God. They can't claim that they did anything to entice him, to make him want them, to do any of that. Right. It was only God's love and grace, and this explains their election. Mm-hmm. And so you even have to start in the Old Testament to go there. But famously, we tend to go...
Right. Yeah. The point is, you can start in the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
It is not just
and I think we
New
forget
Testament
that.
Thing. Yeah,
I do think we do forget that.
Mm-hmm.
But then we jump into the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 famously we have to go from verse 1 through 10. But people talk about that part where it's by grace you've been saved through faith.
Right.
But he leads up to that as well in chapter 2. So what were your thoughts on chapter 2 as you looked at that?
Well, it certainly describes humanity as utterly powerless. Mm-hmm. They are there. There's nothing they can do within themselves.
Right.
And then there's those two words, but God.
Yeah. Yeah, verse 1 really lays out you're walking this way in darkness. And that's very important to see. And then verse 4 is where you're talking about but God. This is something he did that was
what
different.
A difference.
And it drives in several points, I think.
Mm-hmm.
His love, his faithfulness. But also, I believe, and I think they write about that in here, it gives us an assurance. God gives the gifts, he's not removing the gift. So when you say, okay, I have accepted this gift, I'm walking toward salvation, and it's a process. We're not perfect on day one. You're not going to lose that gift.
We're not perfect on year 100
You're not perfect on year 100 either. It's true. It's very true. It just talks about how he loves us. The verse 8, it says in verse 8, for by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not of your own doing, it is a gift of God. Now I'm reading the ESV. Mm-hmm. But here they put a translation that is done by Peter O'Brien. It says a very wooden translation of this verse. In other words, following the very same Greek syntax that it has there, it would read, this not from you, God is the gift. I think it's a different way to look at it.
Yeah, it juxtaposes the you and the God more clearly.
And really, he is the gift. Not just salvation, but God himself, his presence, his holiness, his righteousness, all through Jesus Christ. Yeah. That is the gift. And it's a challenge to our culture today that we want to be able to do a lot of things for ourselves, to fix ourselves, to improve ourselves, to do this.
Well, that's the whole focus of our culture, isn't it? It's all about me.
Yeah.
I mean, in Instagram and Facebook, people post the perfect parts or the ideal parts. And you aren't aware of the mess that's around it.
That's true.
And so it presents a very false picture.
And I think what Paul says to the Ephesian church and to us is we're powerless without God. We can't get there. And it's just, John Stott says, and it's quoted here, that it makes it hard for us to strut around because of our salvation. To look at how good of a Christian I am or what I've done. Well,
we try that too.
We do. And I think it's important that it's noted there. I did nothing to get here except humbly follow follow God, and even in that's a gift,
That's
and
right.
what I have. So, it talks about a little bit about what it means today, Romans 5:8, about who we are, in the fact that we were sinners, God still rescued us. How does that affect this idea? Because I know we're kind of coming to a close here. How does this idea affect how you talk to children and parents, just about working with the kids or being parents in the household, and thinking through that? Because we're trying to develop children who are maybe not yet believers, or maybe they are. We're discipling them, and there's that process. You have both in those Sunday school rooms. How does this affect that area, or what would you tell a parent in that area?
I think that a lot of times children look at the adult world and think that that's the ideal and that's where they want to get to. And as parents and teachers, we need to remind kids that we are all sinners, that what you see in an adult isn't the whole picture, and that we all need Christ.
So would you say in age-appropriate ways, parents or adults, trusting adults that are with children, not just randomly with any child, but trusting adults with children, should be open about the mistakes they make?
Yep.
Open about asking God for forgiveness, and the sanctification process they're going through.
Because we want to model that
Right.
for children so that they understand what it looks like.
And you might share that one way with like a 5-year-old and a different way with a 15-year-old.
Oh, absolutely.
But it could be the same event. You're just less
That's right.
details with one, but you're still showing that you are trusting God's grace. And it is God's grace which secures you through this event, through this failure, through this whatever is next.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
So there's one quote that I wanted to make sure that we went over. It is at the top of page 33. Today, large numbers of evangelicals undermine and effectively destroy this doctrine by supposing that human beings are basically good, that God owes everyone a chance to be saved, and that if we are saved, in the final analysis, it is because of our own good decision to receive the Jesus who is offered to us. And that phrase, God owes everyone, really jumped out at me. What do you think of that?
I think it's something that we tend to process a lot. But what God really owes everyone is to allow them to be destroyed by their sin.
Basically, he owes us nothing.
He owes us nothing. Actually, he owes us wrath. He owes us not nothing. He owes us wrath, and chooses not to, and chooses to have that open door to those people, to leave that grace there. And we'll end with this here. As it ends here, it says, from beginning to end, salvation is by grace alone. So he owes us nothing, but he chooses to. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
And should move us who believe, or those who don't believe to maybe come to believe, to see who he is. And that's what makes your life change, is his grace.
That's right.
Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace, where we accept that, but we don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
And grace is not cheap, it moves us, and we begin to sacrifice life. So it says, salvation is by grace alone. It is a sovereign gift of God, the eternal God, to the unworthy and undeserving. That kind of points back to that last quote you had. Mm-hmm. And it says, it's initiated by God, accomplished by God, and maintained by God. And so I think that is something, if we're going to look at Sola Gratia, grace alone, we know he initiates it, he accomplishes it, and he maintains it until we're with him again.
Yep.
So I think that's a good way to close.
It's very encouraging.
Yeah, it is encouraging.
That he doesn't just initiate it, but he then facilitates it.
He finishes it and moves it on for us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Like I said, you can drop questions and comments below. This is Along the Road, and we hope to see you